I will not be making a big introduction today. I will just really quickly sort of introduce Trent Hoy, who is the educational technologist at NYU, that's New York University, and Trent has kindly agreed to talk to us a bit about gamification, alternate realities, augmented reality in the context of language instruction. So I will let Trent talk right now and let you guys participate in this awesome workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. A hand for you guys for surviving the trek up and down, hither and yon to be here finally. We consider an intimate setting. That's the selling point, I guess, of how you describe it. As Simon mentioned, I am currently an educational technologist and instructional designer at New York University with the School of Engineering specifically. Prior to that, I was a French professor for about 8 years down in Florida. And the talk I'd like to give you today, called Level Up, Teaching World Languages via Alternate Reality Games, takes a look at probably one of my proudest projects of things that I did with my students back when I was teaching, and I wanted to share that with you, show you some specific examples of what I actually did with the students, and then give kind of some ideas about how you can do something similar and take bits and pieces and practically apply it to your classroom or elsewhere. Right now, I'm looking, welcome. This is actually one of the activities that really got me to switch over from classroom teaching into more of a learning experience design for language instruction. So I hope you all find it interesting. Got my dog Marcel in here as well. He features prominently throughout my courses and what I make for them, and he was a key figure in the game that I created as well. So he'll pop up a little bit later. So I apologize for any kind of weird back and forth. I have my notes on one computer and the slideshow on another, so I'm going to do a dance and try not to move too much for the camera. And look at you guys and smile at the same time. It's a lot on a Friday afternoon, but I'll do my best. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is what exactly is an ARG? Oh, and it looks like my fonts are not installed on this computer, so it's going to be fun. Hopefully we have no weird issues with layouts, but we'll do our best. So what is an ARG? You maybe heard of, virtual reality, augmented reality. There's a lot of abbreviations, VR, AR, XR. So ARG, what is an alternate reality game? It's a little bit different. So the closest, I guess, analogy that I can think of is something like a murder mystery dinner show, something like that, where maybe you know about this, but it's kind of a dinner party where you have the host invite some guests over, and they start eating, and shortly into the meal, someone is mysteriously off, there's a death, someone's murdered, out, whodunit. And so the clues are kind of laid by the host, kind of pre-planned, but it's up for the guests to actively search for them and try to find them. And it's not a pre-prescribed storyline of exactly what's going to happen. It really depends on what the guests actually do and how they interpret the clues. And so the host is kind of playing puppet master and is, responding to what the participants find, how they interpret the clues, what they decide to do next, and it's kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes so that the narrative unfolds. But the exact ending is a little bit unknown to everyone involved, even though there's kind of a generic structure. So an ARG is that similar kind of idea, although instead of being limited in time and place to this one room or venue for 2 or 3 hours, it can span both physical and digital spaces. So it could be stuff in your building, it could be somewhere in a different city across the world, it could be a physical object in a book, it could be a digital article, something on a YouTube video or on a website. So there's kind of physical and virtual ideas as well. And it spans time as well. It could last a few days, it could last weeks, it could last months. There have been ad campaigns that have used these kinds of tactics that have gone on for months leading up to the release of a product. So it's quite a bit different in some regards than kind of this mystery dinner theater idea. But the key point here is that both the guests and the person running the show are kind of playing off one another, and where it ends up taking you really depends on that interaction and that kind of involvement is what's key. So a bit of a more, academic definition of an ARG. You could say that an alternate reality games are a new genre of transmedia practice in which players collaboratively hunt for clues, make sense of disparate information, and solve puzzles to advance an ever-changing narrative that is woven into the fabric of the real world. So in this case, we mentioned transmedia practice. The storytelling here is networked again across a variety of physical and digital media. It occupies both of those spaces through the internet. And that game designer, the puppet master, is coordinating the real life and kind of digital activities that the participants are engaging in. And then when they collaboratively hunt for clues and make sense of that information, they're having to work as a community to analyze all of these pieces, parts, and progress the story. And it depends on their ability to do that effectively and work with one another. And then all of their puzzles are plot-based. Like they're woven into the narrative. They're not shoehorned in. You're not just doing this for the sake of doing a task, but it makes sense in the context of the activity why you are doing the next step, the next activity. And so, of course, it evolves according to the player actions. And then being woven into the fabric of the real world, this is not, an exclusively digitative platform. The game platform is the actual real world itself, and what you're interacting with, and what the reality is around you. And so, any sort of characters that the players may interact with. In a video game, you may have a non-playable character that's controlled by the computer AI. But in this particular case, if you find someone who's not a player, there's a real person on the other end, whether it's physically with you or on the other end of the screen somewhere, controlling the actions and responding to you. So it's really tailored on that interaction between the designer and the learner, or the participant in this case. So this is really not a packaged product. You don't go out and buy an alternate reality game and then just give it to people and be like, here, play this, have fun. It's more, if you do find a kind of packaged setup, it's more of like, here's a skeleton and ideas and some tools you might need to go and implement this, but it's really up to you to run it and launch it and make it your own and make it successful. And so it's this collaborative, cooperative series of activities and interactions between the host and the participants, or the instructor and the students if you're using it in a classroom. And it really relies on intense player involvement. The story doesn't progress, nothing happens if the players aren't interacting with one another and aren't working together. And so the designer or the instructor, if it's a classroom, is also very heavily involved in this, playing off of what the players are doing. And so it kind of lies on that continuum between a game and gamification, right? It's not just kind of something with arbitrary game elements slapped onto it, but it's not a self-contained environment. It spills over into the real world. So it really sits in that hybrid space. So what kind of useful elements might there be in ARGs to apply them to educational settings? So some things that you might want to consider is that they employ key elements of gamification. And I'm not talking about giving points or stickers for getting the right answer. I'm talking about things like a narrative, right? You have something that ties together the reason what we're doing, that provides some sort of motivation or context for the activity so they feel naturally situated. Giving the learner some sort of agency and control, being able to choose the path they take or what they do or how they respond in a given situation. Providing them challenge and even a sense of risk, that there is a loss to be had if they do not carefully weigh their decisions and their activities, that there might be even a lose state at the end. You don't always win, that you can do something wrong that causes you to lose the game. And of course it provides you, constant feedback on whether you do something right or wrong. You have that immediate feedback, as well as being able to track your progress as you move forward. And then you have kind of, you see mastery learning, but you see that, of course, in games as well, that they kind of gate you from being able to progress unless you demonstrate being able, to beat a boss or to jump high enough or level high enough. So we see that element as well. And of course, being social and collaborative. And so that brings in a lot of increased motivation, both extrinsic motivation from being a fun, different activity, but also intrinsic motivation. We tend to associate gamification with extrinsic factors. There's a lot in games that are actually truly intrinsically motivating, and ARGs rely on that aspect of gamification, not kind of the more surface level elements that we tend to see applied with games. It also encourages out-of-class engagement. When you don't create this hard line between classroom and real world, where everything blurs together, then participating in the activity naturally is going to extend outside of the classroom in traditional learning spaces. And this also similarly asks learners to collaborate across contexts. So they take what they're working on in one particular class, but then they see it in a real-world application of it, or in an unexpected realm that they encounter or are kind of steered towards because of the design of the activities. This also allows you to differentiate instruction and assessment and really tailor it to the learner. In the same way that games give you the option to choose how you're going to tackle certain challenges, this allows us to turn over control to the student and say, hey, show me what you can do in this kind of free-range environment. And that allows us to really kind of teach to the different skills we want to see them evolve and express rather than particular tests per se. And of course that discourages cheating, right? When everyone does, when you're encouraged to collaborate, work together, to search for stuff and have a situation where no one succeeds unless we all succeed, and my individual performance is based on how I apply this reasonably in whatever context I choose within this story, then there's less pressure to somehow, skirt around the game or the environment to kind of find a solution if there's a path that I can move forward and I don't feel blocked in any way by the way it's designed. And then you are able to develop and harness meta-literacies, all those 21st century skills of critical thinking, analysis, by naturally going through all these different media and pulling in all of these different contextual elements. And that really focuses a lot on the kind of higher order skills. We talked about Bloom's taxonomy a lot. So really focusing on that element of learning and application of the synthesizing and the analyzing. So how do you actually go about making one of these things? It sounds fun to participate in if there's food involved, like a dinner party, I'm there. But how do you make one of these things? So I'm going to start with kind of a high-level overview of some general principles, and then drill into kind of some practical tips, and then show you what exactly I made, and then kind of back out from there as well. So some kind of general things to think about. Having inspiration is a really helpful start. If you have a source material, that can draw a lot. You can draw a lot from that for the kind of the context of your game. In my particular one, I chose Pokemon, so I'll come back to that in a minute. But there's a lot that I was able to say, okay, I don't know how I want to do this, but this is the way it works in this world. How can I translate that to my world? So if you choose a theme that your students enjoy, maybe Harry Potter or whatever, then that gives you a lot of kind of underpinnings of saying, well, it exists like that in that world. What would that look like in the classroom? If I translated that pretty literally, how would that be expressed? So you can get a lot of inspiration for both kind of the narrative context of whatever story you're creating for the students, as well as the activities and tasks you're asking them to actually do. And that is able to help you kind of harness what makes games and gamification effective. You also want to think about immersion. Again, extending this beyond the classroom and not having that hard split between classroom and real world. That the game environment, again, is woven into the fabric of the real world. It never stops, right? When you leave the classroom, whatever happened in your narrative is still going on, whether you're actively engaging with it or not. There are other people that are. So kind of continuing that idea that it extends elsewhere. And this is an opportunity as well to think about integration. How can you kind of take your curricular elements and map those into game design and really make them kind of marry each other quite well and be paired together. And this is an opportunity as well to leverage your existing policies with, in order to kind of use what students have already become habituated to in order to help them kind of acclimate to a very different kind of learning experience. So if you already have an existing assignment structure that maybe this is the end of the semester, you've done 4 units a certain way, you don't want to suddenly throw them a curveball at the very end with finals and everything. You want to say, okay, how can I piggyback off what they've already learned how to do logistically as a student and kind of work that into the game. And it also allows you to kind of employ tools and create different kinds of activities and assessments that naturally lend themselves to a given task or a learning goal, so a chance to explore some new things. And on that, the flip side there, it also gives you the opportunity to innovate and maybe radically change some element of your curriculum that you've been unhappy with. If you're like me and you've taught French 1 about 3,000 times, you get sick of doing it the same way from the textbook that all the different sections have to do. But if there's a way that I can now say, hey, I've got free reign to do this unit how I want, and this is the story and the context I'm creating, how would this look different here? And I have the freedom to flip things around or address issues that I might have with how certain things are being presented, or if I see students are having trouble with certain concepts, is there a way I can reorganize it in a way that they would encounter it a little bit differently? And so one thing, of course, to keep in mind is balancing those two, right? How do you balance, integrating things that are already familiar with innovating and kind of having a nice equilibrium between those so you don't throw anyone off too much. And this is also a great opportunity for instructor collaboration. I will tell you right now that doing one of these completely by yourself is a lot of work. So if you can at all have anyone else that wants to do it and run it with you, that's a great way to split the workload, at base level, but also draw ideas out, get different perspectives on things. And you can also say, if I'm doing this for Spanish 2, and there are 5 other sections of Spanish 2, and I'm having them run around campus and do all sorts of stuff, we can use those same resources, have them all do it together. If that's what they're doing within their class collaboratively, you might as well spread it anyway. It makes sense. And this is also an opportunity for doing kind of cross-curricular things as well. So if you have people in different departments and you say, hey, we're having a unit in German that's about the environment, is there a way we can somehow tie this in with some science course, or maybe pull in history and do something that's collaborative between those and have them explore different domains that maybe wouldn't normally be tackled in kind of unique ways in this game environment so that it kind of makes sense as a cohesive whole. So there's a lot of different opportunities to bring in different perspectives through instructor collaboration. And perhaps the biggest one here is iteration. Start small and test it out, see what works, see what doesn't, try again, try again, try again. Don't jump in from the very beginning saying, I'm going to make the most epic experience ever. It doesn't work that way. So starting small and trialing it and slowly building from there, especially because what works for me isn't going to work for you, isn't going to work for someone else. Everybody's teaching style is different, everyone's students are different, everyone's context is different. So really getting to know what it is that you are comfortable with and what works within your particular context. Especially if you have limitations based on your department or that kinds of thing. Academic freedom only carries you so far in certain regards. So you may have to play around with how exactly that might work. So those are some kind of high-level things to consider. So as far as practically making an ARG, how can we implement some aspects of one? So the first thing first, I tell all of my faculty when I do instructional design consults, design for learning first. We sometimes get distracted. I have a colleague who is really into new media. She wants to do all this cool 360, VR, immersive stuff, and wants to buy, $5,000 cameras and go do a studio setup. It's like, wait. What are we actually making with this, and what is that helping us do? So when you want to design a game, what are we designing for students to be able to do? How are we engaging them to learn from this? Keeping those key elements of instructional design is very important here. So we want to set up a kind of guided discovery model. Not free reign, go run amok, have fun, maybe you learn something, maybe you don't. But how do we set up as the puppet master in this? How do we nudge them in the direction to find things that we want them to find? They may find them in an unexpected order, or find aspects of it that we didn't anticipate, but we do kind of generically know the route that they're most likely going to take. And then how can we use that kind of narrative-driven aspect to motivate them and connect all of these pieces that may otherwise seem disparate to a student? And then thinking about, of course, active learning objectives. What are the students doing? How are they expressing this? How are they showing us what they know, other than just filling in a blank on a test? How are they actively demonstrating that? And how do we create interactions that naturally elicit that? We don't just say, okay, we're going to sit down and ask you these questions and talk to me about your grandmother. How do we make talk to me about your grandmother? How do we say, use adjectives that describe people and have correct agreement or whatever? How do we pull that out naturally within this context? What are things that we could do, based on the narrative, based on what we expect students to do at certain levels, that will call that to the forefront without us having to kind of shoehorn in this grammar activity? So as I mentioned with iteration, we do want to start small and build on those existing resources. So can you maybe start with a standalone activity? What's one activity that you could do and transform and say, hey, how can I make this, rather than, hey, sit with your partner and ask each other these questions and then we're going to talk about it as a group? How can you somehow make that a reason to exist in this world? Is there some sort of context for it? Can we create a role play that is meaningful to the students and not out of a textbook? Things like that. How can we transform a single activity? And then maybe we can make it a sequence, where the second activity is not just, well, we're switching to a new topic and now we're going to learn about this, so do this. But there's a reason that these things are strung together. It's a natural progression from one into the other, that they flow into one another. And then can you turn that into a full class period experience? Is there a way you could design 3 or 4 activities that are a natural connection to one another? You could even do something like maybe a breakout EDU kind of an activity. If you've never heard of that, it's kind of like an escape room for your classroom, which I did one of those as part of this, so I'll show you some examples in a few minutes. But that's a cool activity that really engages students in a lot of different skills and gets them doing things that kind of make sense within a larger context. And then maybe possibly a curricular unit. Could you do 6 class sessions, a full course or a full textbook chapter as this? The answer is yes, you can. I did it. I'm here to tell you about it. But it was not the first thing that I did, and I don't encourage you to start there. So again, iterate, 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 start small and build up, because it is a lot of work both for you and it's also a lot for the students as well. So working that in, stepping small, that helps you iron out the kinks, really figure things out. So now that I've mentioned that I jumped in and went into a full curricular unit, I'd like to share some of exactly what I did. So as I mentioned, this had to do with Pokemon. I themed it after Pokemon Go, and I cleverly called it Forcément Go. So this actually began, when Pokemon Go first came out, I think summer of 2016, I noticed everyone was really into it, they were all focused on it. It was getting them to do things, go out and about and explore and interact in ways that they previously weren't. So I said, is there some way that I can use this in the classroom? And so the first time that I attempted to make an activity, I did kind of a review activity that was a QR scavenger hunt. So rather than just give them a list of clues to go hunt down, I said, well, how could I turn this into a theme? So I said, hey, I'm the Pokemon professor, and all of my Pokemon friends got kidnapped by Team Rocket, who are the antagonists in the game. And I said, you've got to take these clues that my dog Marcel found, and he actually compiled a little Marcel decks with, this is where the clues were written there. So they had to find the different places around campus by following the clues, and then when they would scan the QR code, they didn't just win, they had to battle against this Team Rocket person, and the battles were by doing various activities that reviewed the content that we'd seen that semester. So they were kind of narratively themed, and then as they saved different Pokemon, they were able to eventually fight a final boss kind of a deal. Yes?
Do you mind passing around the booklet?
Sure, yeah. Got a couple actually. Pass that around. Okay, so that was the first one, just kind of a review activity. The students liked it pretty well. Their biggest complaint was, oh, this was during finals week. I wish I had more time to run around campus and do stuff, but I did maybe 2 of them, and that was all I could handle with my workload. So I was like, okay, well, the concept is there. We need to tweak some. So again, we decided to iterate. So the next time I said, okay, well, I've got a professional development presentation that I want to do. I want to talk about this. So is there a way that rather than just demonstrate what the students did, maybe I could instruct my faculty members, my peers, through this activity? I could teach them something about gamification by having them do the activity itself. So I flipped that around. It went fairly well, had them do some other activity, and I said, okay, I've taught my peers to do things. Can I teach my students French content through this? Can I expose them for the first time to this, have them practice, demonstrate, all in a fully encapsulated unit, in a full story? And that's where the third iteration, I called it 2.0 at this point, is the second time students bumped into it. And that's what I'm going to show you today. So in planning this, my first thought when developing it was trying to think, okay, how do I translate my content, what I've got to accomplish in 6 class sessions, how do I translate my content and instruction to an ARG? How can I kind of map what I have to do with what already exists, the structures and themes within this Pokemon world, which the students are familiar with. They may not be the biggest fans, but it pulls up nostalgia, they're all familiar. So we get some base understanding there by highlighting some of these themes. So I said, well, introducing content, that's the trickiest one. You're so used to saying, hey, I'm going to lecture to you guys. I'm going to tell you about this stuff. You're going to listen and take notes, and then you're going to go do it. Or maybe if I'm feeling really fancy, we're going to have a flipped lesson, and you'll go watch a video at home and then come to class. And only 2 of you will have done it, and it'll be a really successful lesson. So I said, how can I do this? How can I introduce content to students, how can I get them to explore it for the first time and not freak out without this lecture style that they're so used to? So I said, well, in the game, they don't make you read the handbook prior to playing. You just jump into the game. You turn it on, boot it up, and it instructs you while you're playing. You are learning by doing. So my thought was, as I'm making this, I need to make sure that whenever students are seeing new content, they're doing something that naturally causes them to need to know this kind of thing. We don't teach you when you first log into the game how to do the advanced thing you're going to do at level 100. We teach you that when you're at level 99 and need to get to 100. So how can I organize this content to be in a kind of a just-in-time presentation where they're learning by doing in this kind of integrated fashion? And I said, well, got to practice it, got to get feedback in some way, got to do homework, love it or hate it, and they need to review content they've seen before. One time just isn't enough. Well, in the games, there's the idea of training, right? You don't just walk in and suddenly you can do everything. You have to practice, you have to fight things and earn experience points, then you level up as a reflection of that progress. So what if I took the practice and feedback, homework, and review activities and somehow turned this into a level up process where they are earning experience points from doing these things and maybe set a minimum threshold they have to pass over, but if they want to do extra, then they're just grinding out more experiencing and leveling up more. You know, so that's kind of what I thought for that one. And then assessment. Yeah, the tricky one. Where do you put a test in the middle of this game? Well, in Pokemon you have battles, right? You can lose a battle if you aren't leveled high enough, if you haven't practiced enough and choose the wrong moves, you can lose the battle. So a battle is a form of assessment. You also have gyms where you have a collection of very strong trainers, usually themed around a certain element or topic, and you have to beat all of them. And then by doing that you earn badges, and you need so many badges to progress and unlock new abilities. So in my classrooms, I've kind of already switched over to an integrated performance assessment style, where I had kind of activity menus where students could pick and choose which activities they wanted to do to demonstrate certain skills. And so that lined up really well with, well, what if I just turn that into this gym? If the gym is the different activities that they're choosing what battle to fight, that seems like a natural kind of fit. And then of course there's a lot of motivation and engagement. There's a lot of different activities and fun stuff I do in class to motivate them. But a lot of that gets brought into the realm from the game as well by having things like teams in Pokemon Go, having some ideas of collaboration, competition, cooperation, having gameplay diversity, right? You get to pick and choose how you want to do certain things. You don't necessarily have to do the same thing every single time. You get to change it up a little bit. And of course there's some element of challenge that you face, as well as the narrative that helps provide some of that engagement and motivation. So those were kind of the things that I said, okay, this seems like a good setup for reasonably translating what I need to do into what is out there and the way this is structured. So from those elements, I kind of came up with some key gameplay features that I wanted to have. I said, okay, if I'm going to sell this to the students, if there's going to be like a box art and you flip it over and there's a label of bullet points of key stuff you want to know about this game, how would I sell it to students? So I said, well, you're going to hatch and raise a partner Pokemon by completing activities and earning experience points to level up. So they came in the very first day. I said, hi, I'm the Pokemon professor. You all are brand new trainers. Here's an egg. You need to hatch the egg. We're going to hatch it together. So we did some activities that caused the egg to hatch. They all got their individual little partner Pokemon to level up and train. And then I gave them all trainer cards, which these were physical cards that I made, and they looked blank, but they all had the students' names on them. And what was cool about this is I used, the application is defunct now, it's been bought out and it's something different now, but it was called Erasma at the time, which is an AR application that allows you to apply digital filters and objects to real-world things. So when the students would hold their phones over the card, it would recognize their name and the design that I created, and their information would show up on their phone. So they would be able to see, oh, what team are they on? What is the status of their little buddy Pokemon? If they wanted to create an avatar, I would upload it so they had their own picture that they created. They could track the badges that they were earning later on at the bottom. So this kind of offered some feedback and progress as they would do it, and I would update it after every class meeting with whatever progress they made. And so they would get to kind of track that. And then I also put this in on our LMS I made each of them kind of a trainer page, so if they lost their physical card, they had a digital one that they could scan. I also helped them track their points to their next level, so they could see how close they were to progressing. And this also helped us as well with knowing how they could earn various experience points, what activities we did in class, or if they missed class, they could see what they needed to go back and do. So it was helpful for them providing some of that feedback. And then along with that, I said, well, you can join one of 3 teams. You can collaborate and compete with your fellow trainers. So in Pokemon Go, you've got 3 different teams that usually don't collaborate. They usually just compete against one another, but I said we can't just do that. You need to be on teams. So we had a couple different levels of how this worked. So we had the individual trainer leaderboards, where as they earned experience points, I'd put the top 5. And so for some students, that was very motivating, wanting to be the top, be the very best, as it were. And they would do more activities in order to earn more points. Said, well, you could also compete as a team. So we had a cumulative team score that was based on contribution experience points of everyone on that team. I tried not to stack the teams. I planned the teams out ahead. This was the end of the semester. So I kind of knew where everyone stood and tried to make the teams as even and fair as possible. So you could see kind of how they stacked out. And then the cool thing was, they didn't just compete with each other individually and as teams. They didn't just collaborate as teams, but there were elements designed into the activities that I asked them to do, into the story, that said, hey, you guys are working as separate teams, and there are going to be times that you all are kind of competing with one another. But there are also times where you each get different pieces of the puzzle. Right? So their homework, they would, after they did the activities, they would get a different clue depending on which team they were on to bring back the next class session, and we would discuss it together. And so if certain people didn't do their homework, that's a missing clue, and we're all going to have a harder time. Or in class, we had similar things as well. So there'd be times where, yeah, they wanted to be the first one, they wanted to be the best team, but if they finished and the other team is over here on the struggle bus, they jumped over to go and help them out and say, well, hey, if you lose, we all lose at the end of the day. So it was cool to see them kind of jump ship and really help one another, where they would have probably otherwise just said, oh, I won, I got my points, I'm done. And so that was a nice experience, both for them and for me to see. And so along with that, as far as what I asked them to actually do, they got to complete a variety of physical and digital activities to learn and practice the new content, all while experiencing an episodic story. So like I said, it was built into the narrative, and they encountered the content for the first time through this. I never told them about it, they just kind of discovered it doing the activities. So some of the activities that we did, I did a mini version of the QR Scavenger Hunt. So here I had little prof stops that I had hidden around campus, and they would have to go hunt them down, and when they found them, they would scan them to do an activity, and then they would ask them to turn it around and bring it back. And there were different clues on the back that they would then have to discuss what everybody found and what that meant, what was the significance of this little shirt, for example. We also did some activities using VR. So we did some activities where they, as part of the narrative, they end up going to Paris. And so they're hunting for clues in Paris, and each group had a different location to go look for clues at. So they were using Google Street View to look at these different monuments and locations around Paris, looking for specific items, and they would report back about what they found, what they were learning, what they're trying to figure out. So that was one of the activities as well. I used a lot of digital tools that you may be familiar with or might have used things like Kahoot, Quizlet, Edpuzzle. I did kind of a flipped classroom setting for their homework, where I had video lessons that they would participate in, and that's where their clues came from for the next day. Again, mentioned Google Street View, and also used social media for a couple activities as well, where they would have to hunt around on social media for stuff and interact with French social media. So lots of different kinds of activities that they could do. Again, all tailored or kind of woven into the story. And then they tackled gym challenges to earn badges. I kind of mentioned earlier kind of the integrated performance assessment approach that I've been taking that I used in this structure as well. So this is an example of the writing gym, and you can see there are 3 famous French people that are all serving as the big trainers that they have to battle, and they each, you can't read it because it's small, but they each have different activities that gave the students different amounts of experience points. So they could pick and choose. Hey, I like this activity from Claude Monet because it's not just, hey, go write a paragraph. It's, oh, take a picture of something or draw something and then write a caption for it. And it all related to the content we were seeing, but it gave them different opportunities to express it in different ways that were more applicable to whatever the real life setting might be, what skills they were looking to develop. And then they could earn, they had a minimum kind of number they had to complete overall, but if they did one activity, they got a bronze badge, 2 a silver, all the way up to gold. And so they could kind of decide how much experience they wanted to earn, what activities looked fun or interesting to them, and then kind of spread it around as long as they did a set number. I didn't care what combination they did. And then, as kind of our ultimate assessment, the very last thing on the last day, they got to join forces with their fellow trainers to face off against a secret boss in the ultimate timed challenge. It sounds pretty epic, because it was. So this is the breakout EDU thing that I mentioned. Kind of that's like the escape room for your classes. So I told them on the first day that that there was going to be some sort of big event at the end, that there's going to be a big challenge, and that they could lose the game. As a class, collectively, they could fail. They may succeed individually, they may succeed as a team, but if they didn't work hard enough, at the end, it could all be for nothing. So they were a little bit scared about that, and this is what that came down to. So I didn't go buy an official breakout EDU, I did the handicraft version for much cheaper, and so I bought boxes, and I put locks on them and made activities, so the students would sit there trying to figure out, okay, here's this puzzle, what do we need to know for it, how do we figure it out, how do we unlock the different boxes. So I would open one chest, and inside there'd be 3 smaller chests, 1 for each team, and they would have to go divide it up and try and figure out, okay, how do we get these smaller boxes open. And then when they did, each of them had a different hashtag inside of it, actually. And so if they searched Instagram or Twitter, I had taken pictures of places around campus. And so that's where I'd hidden more small locked boxes. And so they got to go run around campus and like go find where I'd hidden things and bring them back. And all this is on a time limit. They had 30 minutes because within the context of the story, something horrible was going to happen if they didn't beat the timer. So they had a strong incentive. They beat it with about 5 minutes to spare, so nothing too worrisome there. But that wasn't the end. They still had to fight the actual boss. And this is where the training came in. So I tallied up the total amount of experience points that all of the students had earned, and I assigned a health value to the boss. And I said, all right guys, let's see how many experience points have you earned. Let's see if you've done enough damage to the boss to win. And so it was a very, drum rolling, trying to figure out, was the math good enough? And of course I had done the math in a way that they would barely scrape by, that would be nail biting, but yes, they beat the boss at the end, and so they had the representations of all their partners there that changed depending on various factors during the semester, or during the unit. So that was the way that activity worked. And so taking a look back after the fact, like, okay, so this was really successful, students responded well to it. What was different about it, other than the fact that I did different activities and things were structured differently? Everyone feels it, but can I actually quantitatively state, and visualize how was this different? So I said, okay, here's the way it was structured. I know this is small, I apologize. But in the previous semester, how was my unit set up? So for all of these, it was I introduced the content, students practiced in small groups, then we talked about it together. I presented the content, student practiced in small groups, and then we talked about it together. It was a very similar kind of thing. Only a few times, like up here on day 1, did I let the students explore the content on their own before coming back to me. It was always me initiating it. But within this game, I switched over and I just became the incidental narrator in between. The students were the ones who were always investigating the content, always doing the activities, and I was just there, seeing what they were doing and tweaking my structure as needed based on them. I knew what I was going to set up generically, but if they behaved differently in class, if they found a different way to something, I could tweak it in the moment. And then you see at the end here, they had their different choices of activities and the whole web going on, complicated stuff. So I thought that was an interesting kind of visualization for myself of, how did things actually play out differently when I was asking students to do things differently. So I want to walk you through the actual slides, or at least a few actual slides of what the students saw, because I know sometimes it's a little bit hard to visualize. You're talking about all these things, but I'm not seeing it. So this is one kind of activity. So to give you some context, I think this is the beginning of the 3rd episode, so our 3rd class session for this unit. And the theme of the unit, it was the last unit of the semester in French 2. So the theme was communication and technology. So it kind of lent itself to this kind of activity. But previous to this, when they had done their flipped lesson, each of the different teams received a different physical clue, or a different clue that was a torn up ransom note, basically. So they got a different chunk of it. So when they came back to the class, continued, there we go. And so we have, it's all done in the target language, by the way, there's no English. And so I said, okay, this is Marcel's clue. Marcel, my dog, he found something. And whoop, there you go. And so Marcel found something, and then it was a letter, but it's all torn up. And moreover, there's lots of pieces that are missing from what Marcel was able to find. So, what did you guys find? So did you find anything? And so let's reassemble the letter. So form a group with the different trainers from your team that all found the same pieces parts. And try to create 2 sentences with the words. Like try and logically piece them together in a way that makes sense. Part of the motivation for this was that we had talked about object pronouns, which in French go in a different place than in English, and so they're practicing putting it in the right place. And so when you succeed, then they're going to form a new group with a trainer from each group. So they work together as a group to solve their particular puzzle, and then they all split up and recombine so that everyone had different pieces that they brought to the table to try and figure out the whole thing. And then we attempted to put together the whole letter, all of it. So then when we found all the different pieces and put it together, we then talked through it together and figured out, what was it saying. And so we had this ransom note that basically walked through, Team Rocket had kidnapped the Pokemon, and they want to steal Marcel, they want to trade Marcel for ransom. And so they're using amazing technology that we'll never figure out in order to thwart us. And so that's kind of the generic idea on that one. And so then when we came back, we said, it's a ransom letter. Team Rocket has captured the Pokemon. They want to swap them for Marcel. And that's out of the question. We're never going to give them to Marcel, or never going to give them to Team Rocket. And we have to figure out a plan in order to fight them instead. And so Marcel's going to run off and get more clues. And so we're going to then do an activity to train. And so this is where I segged into the next slides, which were, hey, the Team Rocket mentioned having really advanced technology. Let's see if we can, out-advance them in technology and learn some stuff about technology ourselves. And so I tried to take the elements from class and weave them together in a way that made sense. And so that's kind of a snippet, maybe a third to half of the class was this part of it. So all the episodes were this kind of structure where I was storyteller in the front, providing the incentive for them to kind of jump back and forth. And make progress in the story. So that's kind of what it looked like. And then as far as what students said about it, right? So what did they say? So they said, one of them said, I enjoyed the fact that we actually were able to make a simple game out of learning a language. The traditional way is fine, but in other French classes I had, it just made things so repetitive and mundane. So they liked having so just something different if nothing else. And someone else said, this activity made me strive to do more than what was expected of myself when it came to assignments. In the regular teaching term, I did the minimum for an A. But with this, I was compelled to try my best to complete the maximum amount of assignments that was possible. It was a fun way to learn. So I think by designing interesting activities and giving them the option to do as much or as little as they wanted past a certain point, that some students didn't want to, but others that did, they had additional reasons to do so, where they might not have otherwise. Then a couple more comments. One said, I really love the activity that was somewhat of a scavenger hunt and let us search around campus for the clues to unravel the ending of the story, and the Google Cardboard activities. The overall storyline was so creative because it made me look forward to class and see what we were learning that day. So they would see the different clues and parts and wonder, okay, well, what's going to happen in the story? What's going to happen next? What did you plan? And they became kind of invested in the activities and the narrative. And then someone else said, the final battle against Team Rocket was fun and definitely got the whole class involved, even with helping each other. It was a uniting aspect, and I found that heartening. So that, for me, I guess, was the biggest takeaway, is that the students they've been sitting together in a class all semester. They maybe have their 1 or 2 friends that they always work with, even when I make them change partners. And here we actually got them interacting with one another and working together in quite a different way. So I was happy about that. So if you would like to see what this looks like in more detail at your leisure, I do have a public demo. I don't want to call it an online version because that implies that you could play it solo online, which this is not how this works. But I basically translated everything that I had within our LMS, which I took all of my slides and made it formatted into our LMS. So if a student missed the day, they could still participate in the activity, still find out in the story, and not have be too far behind. So I translated that to, if you're familiar with Articulate Rise, I built some modules using that. So it's more interactive. You can click through. It is in French. There's English notes from myself that are kind of logistical teacher notes, or if it was notes to the students about activities they needed to do, that's in there. So if you go to my website, it's proftrent.com. It's up there for you, and I'll show that to you here in a second as well if you want to see it. But this allows you to explore at your own leisure. All of the activities as originally designed are in there as well, all the different tools that I use. So if you say, hey, what did they do? And click on things and actually do the little activities yourself, you're welcome to. I haven't checked it since like summer of 2017, so hopefully none of the tools have broken and are deprecated in those 2 years. I tried to pick things that were fairly reliable, but there's some weird like niche things that I used because they were the free, cheap versions of stuff. So hopefully they're still around and still work, but you at least can kind of see the idea of how that worked. So to wrap up my kind of presentational part of this, some key takeaways that I hope you can walk away with is that ARGs offer a variety of pedagogical benefits through a narrative-based guided discovery model. That's kind of the key that we see here, is that letting the students lead the learning and explore kind of on their own terms, but not completely unguided, having some sort of oversight where the path has been gently laid before you and it's up to you to follow it or stray slightly as you go. And that an iterative approach to designing and implementing an ARG is the most accessible for integration into existing curricula. So those steps of starting small and really taking the principles behind what makes ARGs effective and applying them to simpler activities. Even if you can't envision or enact something this large scale, that these same principles really do apply to even a single activity, and of course a string of activities that all work together. There's a lot you can draw from these different elements that engage students to switch it up for them and give them a new kind of learning experience and hopefully improve their ability to interact and actually communicate with each other, which is the goal of learning another language in the first place. So that is my talk. I'm going to switch over now to a Q&A. So if you have any specific questions about what I presented or want to see things in more detail, I have all of that available. I'm happy to walk you through any and all of that. A lot of this has also been documented on my website, so if you want to read more about the QR activity, which was the very first iteration of this, that is all documented with pictures, lots of commentary from myself about how it worked, what was good, what was bad. If you want to participate in the activity, apart from the physical thing, everything else is available online as well, so you can explore that. But yeah, any questions, comments, hopefully no snotty remarks, but yeah.
I think I've inferred, how the game platform it certainly gives you a way to verify a student's comprehension of language input, but how does the game platform evaluate student language production?
That's me.
Okay.
Yeah, so, so this is not a complete automated thing. I'm over here, I'm the man behind the curtain running everything, right. So I'm Wizard of Ozing it the whole time. So the students don't see what I'm doing because I'm doing that at home after class. So while they're doing homework and exploring things, I'm seeing what did everything they produced if they had an activity that was involved with writing or speaking. I'm giving them feedback on that and providing that individually to them. Some of the activities did have, depending on what tool it was, had some kind of pre-formatted feedback. Mm-hmm. So some of them were lower experience point values, but were more like typical gamification of like, oh, you did this little matching game, this other Quizlet activity. So they would just get instant feedback on whether they were right or wrong and doing some of those lower level knowledge check kind of activities. And then most of the more involved ones were things that were done in class where I could provide in the moment feedback to students, or they were part of that larger kind of gym assessment where it was that same structure I've been using for the whole semester, so I already had an established feedback model where I would grade and give them detailed feedback for that.
If I can follow up, so yeah. Are there are points at which the evaluation is not simply up or down, but it's okay, 9 points out of 10, or? Yeah,
so some of the activities I just said, if you do it, you get full credit because it's a really simple knowledge check kind of activity. Other stuff I gave them an actual graded score. I had a detailed rubric based on what are the different actual guidelines on like
Right.
different things and said, okay, this is this many points, and we've been using it the whole semester, like I said. So it was nothing surprising for them. It was just the presentation on the outside was different, but the kinds of tasks I asked them to do was the same.
And then that evaluation, based on points gets translated into
Into their
logic of the
grade.
game. Well,
Oh yeah, and that's how they earn their experience
Right,
points.
right.
So at some point, sometimes the experience points values were always you can earn up to this
Yeah.
based on how well you do. You can't just fudge it and get full credit, kind of a thing. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. All the student comments that you showed us were positive. Were there any negative comments?
Not that I can think of. I was really surprised that there was nothing. The only things that I guess you could say were negative were that there were students who just didn't want to do anything at all and being asked to think in a different way and that kind of deal they didn't enjoy, but most of them were very positive about it. There was nothing that was immediately or obviously negative about it.
Did they complain about time?
Complain about
The amount
in what
time
regard?
that they-
Like how much time they were spending?
on it?
No, because they had the option of spending more time if they wanted, but the minimum amount that I kind of required for them was no different than the rest of the semester. So if they were happy with the way that they were performing in class for the first 4 units, then grade-wise, the last one was no different. It's just what they did was the process was different, but the end result was the same. Yeah.
Are you doing this project with other teachers, other?
It was
professors,
just
or-
me. I offered to do the QR activity with the other French sections, and none of the instructors bit. So I was like, well, it's all set up. It's just clues are out there. I have the materials if someone wants to do it, and they didn't ever respond. So I would have loved to coordinate with them, but
Yeah, and do they have problems with you doing different types of activities? I mean, do they match with the curriculum?
no, they didn't really have. I've taught at a couple different places, and this particular community college didn't really care. It was pretty liberal academic freedom. So as long as I didn't kill students, and as long as students ended the semester in generically the right place, they weren't really picky. There were other instructors who weren't finishing the units, the curriculum, so I was the least of their problems. Yeah.
Do you know what process drama is?
I'm sorry, what is?
Process drama?
Mm-mm.
Have you heard about that? Because that's kind of the non-technology version of that has been around like since the 70s, 80s, that people use for education, comes from Great Britain, and just reminded me very much of this because it's also a storyline that's being collaboratively built and where the teacher can sneak in activities that and grammatical language topics that need to be done, and it's I think the main difference is that with this here you have a storyline basically built ahead, and you have all your tidbits of language work that you need them to do kind of built in, and yeah, so I was just wondering if you'd experimented with that, because that's more based on, it comes from drama education, of course. So I was just wondering if you were familiar with that.
No, I'm not. That sounds really cool, though. That's
Yeah.
something that's a
It
lot
might be
kind of-
interesting to look at for some of the comparisons, because
Right.
the motivation and engagement and the narrative, all these effects are there too. And then I think it's a little bit more flexible in terms of that students control where the action goes, but then you have more of the kind of the fixed elements that you have to do for language are easier to fit in with this gamification, and then
Right.
there's also differences in how much competition, how much collaboration do you have, and so yeah, it's an interesting thing to compare them.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, coming back to your point about negative feedback, I did specifically ask the students how they felt about the Pokemon theme, because I was concerned a little bit that with community college students and having, you've got 16-year-olds in high school, and I've got people in their 40s and 50s coming back. How would people respond to that? And the overwhelming response was, well, if this wasn't like my favorite thing, I was at least familiar with it. And there's something kind of nice about like the nostalgia of, well, if this was real, my 10-year-old self would be absolutely loving it. And so here I am, like, this is cool, like it's not the best thing in the world, but it's certainly a fun way versus other ways of approaching it. So I took that as a win.
Going back to the question of time,
Yeah.
were these games done during class time or it was homework?
So the narrative portion, where we were interacting as a class, was all in class. And then there was the homework capacity of it, which was a flipped lesson that they would do. And then they had some kind of follow-up activities that were kind of training and practice review activities, where they had a pool of stuff they could choose from. And this is where I kind of allocated based on what had the homework structure been like for the other 4 units, about how much time were they spending on average, and what kind of replacement activities could they choose from that would equate to roughly the same amount of practice. So it alternated between in-class and out-of-class activities, just like our regular sessions. But what I was asking them to do was a little bit different. And so we really focused on the in-person sessions being much more communicative and interactive, and everything that was kind of presentational and reflective occurring at home. Yeah.
Was this game for beginner level?
It was for second semester, so most students were novice, mid-novice high, had a few intermediate low, but that was like 2 maybe, so most were novice high.
What was the topic of the unit chapter?
Technology and communication.
So in that chapter, what if without this game, what students learn?
So they talked about different means of communicating. So we talked about letters, the post office, telephone. I talked about media, television. We talked about the internet. They learned all the verbs that go with that. Other grammatical points were direct and indirect object pronouns. What else was in it? We talked about the imperfect tense. So the way that wove into the story was when they were building a bond with their partner Pokemon, they were sharing a little bit about themselves and talking about what they were like when they were their partner Pokemon's age and things like that. So it kind of made sense within the context. I think those are most of the grammar stuff.
In terms of learning outcomes, how does the outcomes of this project relate to, well, you said that there were some other sections that did not want to participate, they chose a traditional way. Comparative learning outcomes, if you can comment.
Yeah, I can't really comment because no one, as you mentioned that the other groups decided not to participate, but they decided not to participate in the prior semester's activity, which was the first iteration of this. I didn't offer to do this particular version with other classes because it was so dependent on myself. So I can't speak to that particularly. Just comparing within the class, students' own productions, I found that there was much higher engagement and motivation. I didn't necessarily notice improved production, but I noticed improved practice, as in they did more and it was more meaningful. So I feel like with time, that would result in better production, but I did not immediately notice within 6 class periods, a direct impact. I also didn't do any sort of measured testing to have, quantifiable data.
2 follow-up questions. So you mentioned that you covered certain grammar points.
Mm-hmm.
How do you incorporate this part into the game?
Right.
And the second one, besides gaining points, are there any other means of or forms of assessment? Well, that's connected to the outcome.
Right. So as far as the grammar, I try to think of, within the context of this kind of story I've created, what are things that students would be doing that would elicit naturally that grammatical structure? So like for the direct object pronouns, well, the hardest part for people in French a lot of times is putting the it and the him in the right place. So I said, well, let's make it a note where it's torn up, and they have to reassemble it. So that was one way that we practiced that, and they were exposed to, oh, hey, we saw it modeled in a different order, and we're going to try and piece it back together using that model. And so they kind of explored it for the first time that way, and then got follow-up reinforcement from myself and in their practice. And then like with the imperfect tense, we explored that by saying, oh, we have to describe what things were like. And so the actual introduction to that was they were interviewing witnesses that had seen something, and they were saying, oh, what did you see? So we had seen the passé composé before, and said, okay, well, here's what happened, and then the conditions around it we saw with the imperfect. So they were getting the chance to compare, say like, I've never seen this before, but from context, I know it's a past tense of some sort, and we were able to explore how is it different, what would you probably, say this was, and then get into how are we actually making it. And so there was never a set moment where I said, these are the differences and this is what this means, but they explored it that way and then would produce it by kind of mirroring what they saw. And then as far as assessment goes, this is where the integrated performance assessments came in our penultimate class session, where rather than having a set up test, they had the different choices they could choose to demonstrate different proficiencies. Yeah.
How do you start building things like this? I mean, what do you start with apps? Do you start with ideas, with gamification?
I started with ideas. I said, okay, everyone's liking this Pokemon Go thing, like, and what is it? Why is it engaging people? It's because people are working together. They're going out and about and exploring. There's this idea of mystery and camaraderie, finding out new things, and collecting things. In some cases, competition. And so I said, well, how can I bring those elements into the classroom? How can I use that and inspire the students? And so that's where I really started. And then, like I said, with kind of my grid, I said, well, if this is the way they do it there, how would that naturally pair in my classroom? Where are opportunities for me to use the same structures or maybe change what I do in my classroom? And so those opportunities for me to reflect as well on my own teaching practices and say like, oh hey, maybe this isn't, just because we've done it this way doesn't mean that it's pedagogically the best or engaging this particular group of learners. If I tweaked it, can I justify those changes, for theories and things. Yeah.
You use this game in particular for one unit.
Mm-hmm.
What were you doing on the other units? And they complained, I don't know if this was kind of the last unit and they said, oh, this was the great thing, or if you did it kind of in the middle and then the rest went back to the same process.
It was the last unit, so I didn't have to one-up myself. So I wouldn't say there's anything quote-unquote wrong with the way that I'd been teaching before, but if nothing else for me, I was getting bored after teaching how to say je m'appelle 5,000 times. You want to make it interesting for yourself. So if nothing else, I was enjoying doing this, and they were feeding off of my energy for it. And I think that in my typical teaching, that does a lot for the students, and the way that I set up the class draws on a lot of these activities decontextualized, and this is an opportunity for me to try and put it all together within a cohesive whole, rather than being disparate pieces, parts that were in isolation, still completely valid learning mechanisms, but within a different context in this case.
Do you have within your plans to do every unit with a game?
I'm not currently teaching. I'm not sure when I'll jump back in the classroom, but that would be a lot. I'm not sure if I'm at the point where I would want to say, hey, let's do the entire course this way. I think for me, one unit by myself was exhausting enough, especially because I was designing and making while it was running, so I was laying the tracks in front of the train, which I would never want to do again. I would want to have more buffer time than I gave myself. So I would run it a second semester with what I've already made with minor tweaks. I'm not sure, both for myself, for the amount of work it would be, as well as for the students, if doing a full course that way would really be appropriate or useful. I think after a certain point it might be a bit of burnout, and if the whole point of doing it was to give them a different experience, and then you just painted over it with one experience, it kind of defeats the purpose in some regards. So I think exploring, maybe doing each unit as a different kind of learning model might be more of an interesting exercise for myself and for the students, rather than trying to do one different model for the whole course, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, just comment on that. I mean, one other idea, and maybe you have an opinion on that, would be to have a bit of that going on through the semester.
Yeah.
And that's usually what I do with drama, for example, that, I introduce it in the beginning slowly, and then, it'll reappear from time to time, and maybe we'll even draw a story along, and get on with a narrative over the semester, but we won't have like big blocks of just that, so.
Yeah, breaking it up and saying maybe, every unit will do a couple things, rather than being every class is always this. Yeah.
I'm very intrigued by sort of the idea of branching narrative, and I was wondering if you could sort of just break down a little bit how that's realized. I mean, obviously you can't have
Every possibility, yeah.
Right, and so could you just give a couple of examples on, where the student choices lead to A versus B?
Yeah, so there were a couple places where they got to choose what monuments they visited using VR, and so I had prepared a couple different clues that kind of no matter the combination, they would most likely arrive at the right solution to move forward, but they got to have kind of that sense of, oh, my choice mattered, which of course it mattered, but it wasn't game ending if they did something different than what I had kind of predicted. So none of the choices that they had as far as the branching went were kind of put them in danger of getting so outside of my skeleton that I didn't have a reasonable way without having a Deus Ex Machina to like move us back onto the path. So that's kind of how I did it, if that makes sense. The biggest one for me was having the end fail state where I told them, if you don't do this, you could fail. So they could have maybe even done all the experience that they needed and had enough attack to beat the boss. But if they didn't finish in time on that timed activity, well then it's all for naught because it's over kind of a thing. Although I feel like that would have been more on me for not designing the activities to be done properly in that time period. But that was more of the idea. I think in the future I would explore a little bit more with the branching narratives. In this first iteration I was trying to think of how can I even reasonably put all this stuff together in a way that makes sense and give them a little bit of wiggle room in how they did that. So there were a couple activities here and there that were branching. But it was more tied to giving the students different things to bring back to the table when they kind of went out and came back in individually and as a group. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
You should go first.
Go.
Okay. I was just wondering, with those time limits and things that have to be accomplished within an hour, we've talked a lot about accessible, inclusive teaching lately, and so I was wondering how that interaction would go, how you can accommodate students who, for example, have processing issues and just take a lot longer with things, or how would that mesh with this kind of relatively fixed setup where they have to accomplish things in a certain order and within a frame time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and to be completely transparent, not something I considered when initially designing this because my fun idea in design trumped those considerations in the sense that at this point in the semester I already knew who my students were, and that was not something I had to consider. I'd had previous semesters where I'd had blind students and I had done different things for them, so if I'd had maybe a blind student in this course, all of the activities would have been designed with either that in mind or with alternatives that would be equal, that were no way lesser. And so I think in that particular regard, because what I wanted to do was me by myself, trying to do something so complex that would have really been tailored to the individual students that I had in that moment, rather than trying to foresee any possible situation and make some sort of universally applicable thing. But yeah, it's a really good consideration. Bringing it online, you raise a lot of those same questions, right? Which is why the online version is simply, here's an interactive thing you can click through to see what I did, rather than have the 100% legit experience. But yeah, that's definitely something I want to consider.
In terms of the logistics, by putting the clues we're putting all over campus, did you have to tell anyone that was part of the French class?
Yes, so there were a couple times that I actually involved people around campus with this. I forgot to mention that. But like we had a secretary who spoke French, so one of the clues was with her and they had to talk with her in order to actually get it. I put some stuff like in the library art gallery and around the campus, and anytime I put it somewhere that was not like a typical thoroughfare or anywhere that might be questionable, I made sure that campus safety or like that office was okay with it, and I had a backup plan to change it in case it needed to be, but I verified it all ahead of time. That way I wouldn't have run into the issue. I did have one issue where a turtle took my sign. It's in Florida. So of course this happened. A turtle tore down the sign that I had like under a bench. It tore it away and pulled it into a pond because I had students telling me, we can't find your sign, and I went and found it, like these big bite marks out of it and turtle stuff. So I had to replace it, but no humans interfered with my stuff.
Right. Yeah, we are looking at your website,
Yeah.
and we're checking about how beautiful
Oh,
it looks.
thank
You use WordPress?
Yes.
Which the free version?
It's the one-up paid version.
Like Premiere?
I guess that's what it is.
Yeah.
I don't look at
Oh,
it.
that looks so different.
Thank you.
This looks good.
Yeah, we are looking at web design
Yeah.
and things like design and
Yeah,
all
yours
that.
is so clean. Yeah.
It looks
Thank
very
you.
good.
They're clear. Good for it. So.
Any other questions, comments?
Going once. Twice. Okay, thank you, Trent, for this exciting, inspiring, and overall awesome whirlwind through AR, VR, XR, augmented reality gamification, all the catchphrases of today. Thank you.